Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jodi.
And I'm Eliot.
And before we jump into our story, there's a couple things we want to hit on, a couple little mini stories, pre-stories.
Pre-stories,
Pre-stories. Yes. So here's some cool data that I haven't told you about yet from the Libsyn statistics that I was yes, I did spend my Labor Day weekend playing on Libsyn statistics because I'm a nerd like that.
I love statistics.
I know you do. And I sort of caught the bug. So I was checking around to see who's listening and where they're from. And I stumbled on something really cool, but kind of shocking.
What's that?
We now have listeners in, guess how many countries?
Guess how many countries? I'm going to go with North America. So
I was going to say if you guess a really big number, then it'll be really disappointing for me. So keep it
612. No. I know we have the UK. I know we have the United States because my mom tells me, and so there's one. And I know that we have Canada.
Yep.
So it's got to be more than that. So I'm going to go
more than 3.
I'm going to double it. I'm going to go with 6.
No, 28.
28 countries.
28 countries.
I don't know if I can name 28 countries.
I know. I definitely, because I have a horrible geography brain. But, and if my husband's listening to that, he's shaking his head. Yes, she does. It's embarrassing. Yeah, 28 countries, which has 2 pieces of significance for me. One, just that's really cool. It just makes me happy for obvious reasons. 2, this week has just been really, I have a full heart this week with so many friends in either Texas or Florida who right now is preparing for Irma.
Or the Northwest.
California with the fires. And it's just, friends in Puerto Rico. And there are just people everywhere that I'm worrying about so many people right now, just that connection to that we're actually talking to people who live in some of these countries. So just know that we're thinking about you. Our hearts are with you.
We definitely are. I mean, one of the people that does work on So Here's My Story, as you know, my virtual assistant, Melissa, had to evacuate from Florida.
Actually, one of our sponsors, Cat's Copy, lives on South Beach of Miami. So she and her entire family have evacuated. So.
Yeah. And I spoke with, as you know, John Lee Dumas from Entrepreneur on Fire, and we're going to be airing that discussion a little while. And I'm being interviewed on his podcast in a little while as well. And he's actually in Puerto Rico. So he's battening down the hatches. So
they're going to get Jose as well.
Yeah, they're going to get Jose as well.
Yeah. So just on that serious note, a lot of love, a lot of prayers, a lot of thoughts out to all of you in those countries. So. Absolutely. And as much as we like to be funny, we can't skip over those things.
No, we can't skip over those things.
But now we're going to move on to awkward things.
Yes, awkward things. We had sent out on social media just to kind of story source and find out some of the experiences of our listeners.
Well, because we're adding a new segment. I mean, I think we said this a little bit in our last episode. We're adding, after we do the story, there's going to be a segment that we've planned for a long time, but we finally feel like it's the right time. So we're going to be crowdsourcing stories, and at the end of each segment, be reading your short pithy stories. So that's kind of where we're headed here. But we've been collecting them for about a week. We're going to collect some more.
Right. And we've gotten a response. We had sent out the hashtag awkward interview just to kind of get that, to spur some stories on that topic. And we got some really interesting responses. I'm not going to read all of them, but I do have to mention one that we got in.
I think this one might be my favorite. So there's a couple of really good contenders, and I can only assume that we are going to get some even more fabulous ones. But at the moment, this one might be my favorite.
Yeah. And so it came in from one of our listeners. And what the story is, well, I once had an applicant, so I imagine they're sitting in an interview. I once had an applicant start one of her responses to one of my questions with, "Here's the thing about working for Jews." and I can only imagine the recoil and the shock. But anyway, so what our listener said in describing the story said, well, the applicant went on to be very complimentary, but I just couldn't shake the intro. And I can imagine.
Here's what I found about working for Jews.
And I'm fascinated by what had to be that pregnant pause of, what's going to come next in that sentence. But
so you don't think that's ripped from the pages of like interviews for dummies or like, top 5 ways to start a sentence?
Yeah, see, I don't know the beauty of this. And this is one of the ways somebody had gotten to us where I don't have the name, I don't have the company or anything like that. And anonymous is perfectly fine. So I don't know whether the person who wrote to us actually wrote Interview for Dummies, but yeah, it's just hysterical. When I saw that, I knew I had to mention it on air.
Yeah. So please contribute. You can contribute through Twitter with the hashtag #MyAwkwardInterview. Also via Facebook. You can post on our Facebook page. You can email us at talktous@sohere'smystory.com. Any way you can get to us, you can submit your stories. We will be collecting them for a couple of weeks. We expect in these beginning stages, it's going to take a little while longer to collect the stories. And as soon as we have a good 3, 4, 5, 7 ones that we just love, we're going to add this next segment and then move on to our next topic. So we'd love to hear from you.
Yes,
love to hear from you.
So with that, last thing I want to make sure that we do is to thank our patrons.
Mm-hmm.
So first, we, of course, would like to thank Tom Loveland and Mind Over Machines, Cat's Copies, the architecture firm of GWWO, Herbert and Ethel Inc., and Mary Craft Staffing and HR Solutions.
On to the story.
On to the story.
So here's my story. And I pause on the word story because it's a little bit less of a story and more of like a mosaic of stories all as one. I'm not going to tell them all. Don't worry. You're like, okay. Oh God, here we go. I'm going on a story bender. It's funny. You and I endlessly joke about whatever it is that I do, the title of the work that I do in the world.
Whatever it is that you do well.
Yeah. But this week, I've had some people joke sometimes that, if there was such thing as business therapy, that would be what I do in the world, but never so much as this last week, in the last probably 10 days, almost every call I got, certainly an exec team, leadership team, actually 2 of them that I was facilitating, because I facilitate a lot of those monthly meetings, they were all emotionally charged and complicated, and not necessarily because of the issues, but just because of built up emotions and things going on in the space, that there were always very real business issues in every single one of these. So it's not like somebody was just being purely emotional. So there was always something very important, a decision to be made, an action that needed to be taken or something. But it was hard to get to that part of the conversation because I always, it's a weird metaphor, but I think of it almost like this peanut M&M. There's a peanut in there, and it's an important truth that is rational and needs to be dealt with. It's a tactical issue often, or a strategic decision. But there's all this chocolate around it that you have to dig through to get to it. And that's all the emotional reactions that often people aren't even aware of. And so I came off of this week thinking about this concept of emotional hygiene and how in business, because the flip side of this is how often people are either apologetic that there is an emotional part to what's going on for them in their business, or that they're acting, whether it's childish, or that they're angry, or that they're sad, or that they're frustrated, or that they feel left out, or, they all sound like things maybe a kindergartner would say. But if they're honest, they're resentful about something or whatever. And you have to deal with that stuff. And people they literally say things to me like, sorry, we had to spend time on that. Or I know I'm just ranting, or sorry, but they're apologetic. And I'm like, whatever that is. I think it's a really, we talk about real honest business. I think there's a huge disservice in the business world that somehow, somewhere along the way, somebody made up that business doesn't have anything to do with ever feeling a personal emotion to things. And because of that, it's like no one has ever made it okay to brush your teeth. The emotional version of brush your teeth in business to keep the spinach out of your teeth. And so all this plaque builds up, and then it's problematic. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that. Like, is that just because I love these conversations, or do you see that in even the legal work that you're doing with people, where the emotional buildup then gets in the way of dealing with the actual problem that's there?
Well, first of all, I have to say, as you well know and would expect, I am much more comfortable with the peanut M&M story or metaphor than the hygiene metaphor. And I was really prepared to go to you said you had to dig through the chocolate to get to the peanut truth. And I was going to, as long as you don't sugarcoat anything. But look, last week, as you know, we have an email list for people for the podcast. And one of the things I said last week is that whoever said that it's not personal, it's just business is an idiot.
Yeah.
Because it is personal. And in law, you asked whether, do I ever find that in law? The real question is, do I ever not find that in law? Because seriously, sure. You have things where all the time I run into, well, if he wants it, I don't. It's an emotional reaction. I don't want to let him get his way on this, or he's just saying that to spite what we're doing, or there's something that's going on that's making me uneasy. I don't know why, and I can't find it in a statute. I can't find it in a legal book. And the most effective thing, especially for clients, when you're trying to get to a place of shared interests and of mutual advantage, and what's keeping people from doing that is not often substantive disagreements on the issues or the outcomes. What's keeping them from doing that is baggage. Either the perception that if I agree, it makes me look weak. If I'm somehow giving up something, I don't know why he wants that, but if I give it to him, there's a problem there. Or it makes me, I look in some way, or it doesn't serve me. It's all emotional.
Am I winning?
Am I winning? That's the big thing. If I do this, am I winning, or is he going to be hanging up the phone and laughing because he got one over on me?
Yes. So how do you? Because ever since all week long, I've been thinking about how I wanted to bring this up on the podcast. So I've been noticing some of the things I do to, the practices I use for myself I do love the metaphor of the chocolate peanut. The peanut chocolate M&M, whatever. But I actually, sorry to say, think the hygiene metaphors is more useful in this topic.
That's
because
okay. I'll deal with it.
Okay. By the way, are you squeamish? I don't know this about you.
No, I'm very, very comfortable with peanut M&Ms.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. So it's not that you're not comfortable with hygiene.
Right. I prefer peanut M&Ms to anything else.
To me, the word hygiene feels important here because it alludes to a regular practice of cleaning, a regular practice of getting rid of that which shouldn't be there, which doesn't need to be there anymore. And that's the part I think that I feel like it's not so much that it's missing, but like no one ever apologizes for needing to brush their teeth. It's just an accepted part of your hygiene practice that no one's like, oh, sorry, food buildup. I'm like, no, every day you have to brush your teeth. And I suspect that if we could get more comfortable with the fact that business comes with there's such thing as business plaque.
Yeah,
and
they're absolutely.
Business emotional plaque. You have to brush your teeth, you have to floss your teeth, and you probably need people who will tell you that you have spinach in your teeth so that you can go brush in the middle of the day kind of thing. So that's what I want to explore today is like how, what are your practices for emotional hygiene in business? What do you find works with the people you're talking to? So
for me, there are a couple of different facets. One is inside the four walls, with your employees. And then the other is outside, whether it's your vendors or people with whom you have a contract, et cetera. With the employees, and for each of those facets, I think there's an art to the check-in. And this is the mistake that I think a lot of companies make. And the temptation is we're only going to talk if there's an issue, but there's not a check-in. So that if I'm talking to my employees, I really have to make time, and sometimes I'm better at this than others, make time to say, is this working for you? What do you want to accomplish here? Do you want to, I don't know, build your personal brand, get better at your trade, have better quality of life here, whatever it is? What would make this job? We talked in previously about that call about if you sign this contract, why would you call me in 6 months begging me to give my help in getting you out? That's the regret. But what I often find that we don't check in on that I have to get better at checking in on is, hey, if you decide to join my company, if you decide to sign this contract with me, what would make that a home run for you? What would make this the best decision you've made in your professional life? And then you have to check in, the spinach in my teeth thing. You have to check the mirror. You have to look at the person on the other side and say, hey, and do that awkward grimace thing. Do I have spinach in my teeth? So you've got to say, we talked about what would make this a home run for you. Is it a home run for you now?
Yeah, it's funny. I think of it in much more. So I totally support that as sort of like the instead of performance reviews and whatnot, having those conversations all the time. When I think of this topic of emotional hygiene, I think I'm thinking of it in a much more granular way. And certainly it's probably coming up in my mind because a couple of these I have occasionally joked that I do like the business version of couples therapy. And when partners aren't getting along or when direct reports they're having trouble communicating. And I've noticed that especially if tensions are high, that if things have been really bad, if people are at that place where one of them could say the sky is blue and the other one's going to take offense to it somehow, that if they have found some way back to some common ground, that it can be useful to literally go one of them on a weekly check-in. And it sounds so contrived and awkward, but this is why I'm fascinated with this topic. But to literally say, because the priority becomes how do we keep this relationship clean? If we tidied it up a little bit, what does it take to keep it clean? And so they literally ask each other, like, has anything happened in the last week that feels unresolved or that was uncertain, like something I said that maybe didn't land right, or something you said that, like, they actually have to consciously, at least for this period of time while they're kind of rebuilding some trust, they have to make it really overt. And I think that's what I think is missing a little bit in the business world, is it being okay to not make the emotional hygiene in business an accidental, tangential thing, and to be actually addressing it directly, whether that's with another person, like that example I just gave, or for me. I've had some of my clients call me and say, you have to talk me off a ledge because right now I'm super irritated with my employees and I need to like talk through it so that I can be constructive when I talk back to them. That is totally normal. I mean, I know I've had those moments. Have you? Is that something you've resonated with?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah. You're like, you kind of have to you have to clean through all the mess and then you can actually be rational.
Yeah, I have that a lot. And sometimes it's just on the small things. I know this isn't what you're talking about, but
no, actually, it's almost always the small things.
But, I'll hammer out, what I was going to say is I'll hammer out this scathing email, something that gets me upset, and I'll send it to one of the lawyers here and say, okay, before I hit send to the person it's really directed to, look through this. Let's take an emotional checkup. And they can say, no, you've got to dial it back. But I once heard somebody tell me, and it stuck with me, that there's the difference between anger and rage in a business climate, or maybe even in personal, is that anger is over a specific issue that's happening now. Rage is when you start with, you always do this. And because I'm not even talking about what got me upset at this moment. What I'm talking about is all the built up stuff.
Yes.
That, so to your point about this weekly check-in, everything okay? Well, we started out this business and we were both working our rear ends off. But then you started to notice that I was coming in not at 8, not at 9, but maybe at 10. Mm-hmm. And my lunch was, 2 hours and all this stuff. Yeah. And it started to really irritate you. And without that kind of check-in, without brushing the plaque off, at some point it's going to blow up, and you're not going to be angry at just what I just did or that I missed this deadline. You're going to, in your mind, burbling up is, you always do this. You always come in at 10 and take 2-hour lunches. And what did you think was going to happen? Yeah.
Yeah. That is absolutely one of the kind of canary in the coal mine sort of, or I don't even know what you want to call it. I want people to notice in their language, because just from a communication and brain standpoint, when someone hears the word always, or never, they literally instantly, I know you can feel this in yourself. You think of like the one time you did or the one time you didn't. You're like, that's not true because that one time I did. Yeah, exactly. And therefore it negates your entire thing. But you can't step over the fact that if you've gotten to the never always, that you are resentful about something that you haven't had good hygiene on. And I think that is the perfect, you've helped me sort of narrow in on the thing that I think is important is resentment is always 100% of the time something that you have let build up. Like there's no other way to create resentment, for resentment to be created other than you allowing things to build up that you're not dealing with.
Right. And you can't deflect on that. You can't place the responsibility on somebody else. If you have resentment, it's because you did not address it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I used to get asked, and sometimes I still do, to speak for a lot of women's groups. And one time this came up where this woman said, well, what do you do when, because it was a talk about time at the time and strategically using it and women in business. And she said, well, what do you do when everybody who, everyone expects you to do everything, and sort of with this whole thing about like, there's never time for me. And I said, well, I have a nice answer and I have a real answer. Like, which one would you like? And she goes, I guess I want your real answer. And it's a similar thing, like resentment. Like resentment is always yours. And I know that I have some work to do when I hear myself say to my kids, do you have any idea how much I had to do to make this happen? I'm like, oh, there it is. Like I am not practicing good hygiene in whether it's how my time is used or, whatever it's going on. There is like a need there for better practices. So yeah, no, I think that's just really
But then the question is, okay, if I buy this, if I buy that resentment is my problem because I didn't address it, that still doesn't get to the best way to address it.
Yeah.
Because people aren't always receptive. So how do you could give that woman that asked the question the hard answer. Mm-hmm. Of, well, you just have to address it. That's all you have to do, But you have to drill down from that. So what kind of advice do you give to people to actually start the difficult practice of brushing their teeth, getting the emotional plaque off?
In the tiniest, most inconsequential ways possible. What this is like having to teach someone how to actually like scrape the what's it called? Gingivitis. Like really hard. I don't really want to get into dental metaphors here. Let's just stop that. Let me back up for that for a second. Again, it's like the building the muscle thing. It's finding the tiny ways to handle like the next thing that comes up in the moment. I don't think there is a lot of value. I can't say that there's never value in it. Sometimes you have to clear the air of like, if there are grievances that are there's so much resentment that you have to clear the air on them. Sometimes that's needed. But most of the time for the things that I'm seeing, it's more little things in the moment. And I don't necessarily buy that those things, they're not on a literal shelf that you have to deal with all of them and process through all of them for them to go away. Sometimes, and so I think it's worth at least starting here. If you just deal with the next thing that comes up, so the next time the person comes in at 10 o'clock, you don't try, I think that's the piece. You don't need ammunition. You don't need 10 years of them coming in late to validate your issue with them coming in late. You could say like, hey, this is a problem. And if you deal with it in that moment, it's the brushing the teeth daily versus trying to figure out how to do some big project of it and try to deal with the little things as they come up. It can sometimes make some of the other things feel better. I know that sounds very vague.
There's a skill to that. I think that's absolutely right. First of all, if you tell me the morning I came in at 10, hey, you're coming in at 10 and you used to come in at 8 or whatever, however you want to phrase it. The phrasing is important in several respects. Number one, if you phrase it correctly, I can't argue the fact that, the little hands on the 10 and the big hands on the 12 and I'm just rolling in. Yeah, I came in at 12. I can't argue that I always come in at 10. The second thing is that the person who's raising that issue, if they're going to start with little things and raise it, their tone and their language and their demeanor has to be befitting a little thing.
Yes.
Because they might have 2 years of rage built up. But if they've decided that the content of the conversation is on the little thing, they can't punctuated with 2 years.
They can't bring the
rage.
napalm.
Yes, they can't bring the napalm.
Well, and some of this goes back to, episode 7, which when we talked about the just say that tactic of, I think there are ways to, if you can manage, that's a great point. I think there's sort of a couple stages here. First of all, you have to get your rage and anger in check. And that might involve talking to somebody else just to kind of vent it out, get some of it, get clear on what the actual issues are that need to be addressed and which ones are the pile-on of resentment and anger. And so that you can be as clear about what the issues are as possible. Also, sometimes I find when I'm doing that with people that I have this one client who, when he is getting plaque built up, the level of the things he wants to talk about get lower and lower. They become more and more and more petty. So like the things that he is irritated by are these like little cluttery things of like, Stan left a pencil at the front desk again, kind of like, really? That's what we're going to talk about today? Because that's where like your sensitivity has gotten to.
Yeah, the nerve is so raw.
Yes. So like, I think you have to tamper down the nerves a little bit and be really clear, like, do I really care about the pencil or am I irritated about something? Am I feeling generally taken advantage of, which is a totally different conversation. So I think there is some triaging of what is the real issue here. And again, I think a lot of times you need a third person for that sometime, another person, not a third, to help you sort of sort that out. But then to come at it, you said something kind of interesting is, if I said, and this may be the law background here, you said, if you say this, they can't argue with you versus if you say that, they can. I'm not always looking to have an inarguable perspective. Like when I talk those things through with people, again, and we talked about this in the Just Say That episode, it's as like sort of pointing out what the issue is and making it partly their issue to solve too. Like the company needs this from you. There's elevating the conversation to not like, I'm mad you come in at 10 versus like there is an impact to you coming in at 10. So just saying like, you're coming in at 10, that has this impact. What can we do about that? And it's I don't know, it's taking it from a wagging a finger standpoint to a problem that we both have that we need to solve.
And I agree with that, but I'll tell you where the inarguable comes from. And it's not the legal who's going to win, who's not. There's a difference between you ignore me or I feel ignored. Because if I say you ignore me all the time, you may not feel that, but I'm putting that on you. I'm saying this is what you are actually intending to do. And you can say, no, I'm not. I'm not ignoring you. I know you're there. I've acknowledged you. I've done this. But if I say I feel ignored, you can't argue with that successfully because I'm just telling you how I feel.
No, perfect. To me, that dividing line, which I think is a really important one in this conversation, is being clear about what's yours and stopping short of ascribing intent to the other person.
I think that's absolutely critical.
Yeah. You can say like, this is a problem, but when you go, you do this because you think that you don't have to, like when you're ascribing intent, that is where I think things go sideways really quickly.
Yeah. And so I think that as I said before, I think that the language is so important. And that's why when you had said, hey, maybe you really should vet this with a third party or with somebody outside, somebody who's not the main focus of your conversation, because as I always call it, war game it. I might have this conversation, whether it's with myself in the car or whether it's with my wife, just saying, this is really bothering me about X and let me just talk this through. And so she can talk it through. And she has said to me on occasion, look, I don't know the person that you're talking to, but if it were me, I would feel like you attacked me for this. And what I took from that is I'm not going to get to the main point I really want to explore and, to your point, resolve, because they're going to feel attacked.
Yep.
They're going to respond in kind.
Fight or flight.
We're going to get completely off the rails.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And when, it's complex enough to watch when I'm when I'm talking with one person and we're doing a one-on-one where there's some of this emotional hygiene, it's like the Olympic version when there are 5 people in an exec team, all having different reactions, where somebody's charging, somebody else is going the flight route where they've crossed their arms and they've slid back into their chair and they're in fine mode.
Whatever.
Fine, whatever. Say, no, really, what do you think? It doesn't matter. So, it's like ding, ding, the alarms are going off. But the fact is, I think when I think about I've been thinking all week, like, what do I mean by emotional hygiene? I think we've named some of those things. It's knowing when you need the pause so that you can kind of pull your head together, knowing when you need to talk it through with someone else because you can't find the clarity in it. Right sizing your attack. Like, are you trying to resolve if you want to use the word always or never? It's probably a great clue that you are going at the meta level of resentment, napalm, versus trying to deal with this one thing. And I would add one more, which is being really clear on what outcome you want from it.
Yeah.
Like, are you trying to ground them into the dirt so that it feels good, or are you actually trying to create, what is the outcome you're trying to get?
Right. And so that, I think, is something that I try to make it a practice, not always successfully, but I try to make it a practice to do. So, for example, back in one of the firms I worked in way, way long ago, I noticed that the senior partner would walk past my office to the attorney next door and ask him if he wants to go to lunch. And this would go on all the time. And I knew they were friends and all that stuff, but I really felt ignored. And I thought, I mentioned this all the time and I was getting irritated, more and more irritated. But then if you think about the outcome, what do I want him to do? If I say this and then he invites me out to lunch, is it a pity invite? So is there...
We have to invite Eliot.
Yeah, we have to invite Eliot. So yeah, I had to, and I know that's a stupid example, but you have to think through.
No, that's my point though. They're always 100% of the time, someone will like ... And I know this is just silly. Like it's always silly. It's always stupid. It's always kind of childish. You always sort of feel a little bit like 7th and 8th grade when you are practicing emotional hygiene.
But sometimes it has a point. Sometimes there is no good outcome for the conversation. So unless it's just, you want to be heard or whatever. But yeah, you do have to think, what do I want to accomplish?
Right. So if what you want to accomplish is to be included, there are other things that don't involve that conversation. It could be like, how about I invite people to lunch and just start becoming, for all we know, they think you may have had a reputation for being like heads down and they didn't want to bother you.
And that's fine. But you're right. So you have to separate the perceived slight from the actual need,
Yes.
And
do you need to fix the slight or do you just want to get the need met? And sometimes you can go a completely different route to get that need met.
Exactly. And so that's where I think the metaphor of emotional hygiene is incredibly apt because, and you even brought in, gingivitis, for which I compliment you. Because if you just decide to brush your teeth once a month, you may remove some plaque, but it's not going to get at the need to maintain, health. So the real key to it is regular check-ins and make it part so that you drink before you're thirsty and you brush before you've got a root canal issue.
Well, and that I would say, I would back up and say all of this, the prerequisite, the very first step in all of this, step 0, is just the awareness that you're doing it or that you're having an emotional reaction and letting that be okay. And my greatest teacher for this is my 10-year-old daughter. Who just magically, she is exactly the woman that I want her to be. And I just have to figure out how to parent her in the process. But she is magical at being able to push my most emotionally irrational buttons. And she is really, I love the fact, if I'm honest and rational about it and I don't have my own reaction to it, I love the fact that if I do something that the other day I was rushing her to get something done. And I said, well, if we don't do that, then you and I can't watch that show before you go to bed. And then I sat there and played on my phone for 20 minutes, which I hadn't even noticed. And she came to me and said, Mom, can I tell you something? I said, what I always say, always. You can always tell me anything. And she said, it seems not fair when you rushed me and said that if I didn't go ahead and get it, that we wouldn't be able to watch that show together. And then you were on your phone for a while, and that doesn't seem fair.
Wow.
And I will tell you that in that moment, I had like the most childish, like, thank goodness I stopped it before it came out. But I wanted to be like, well, you know what? Like,
I worked all day and I did this.
I was actually doing something important. It was important, but that doesn't make her wrong.
No.
And this is the outcome piece. This is like why she is my Yoda of these lessons, is that I have that, like, I'm aware of it. I can literally hear myself being a complete baby about it and the things I want to say. And this is this is why I want to tell this story. It would feel good to say those things.
In the moment.
Yeah, in the moment. And as my husband has teased me, he was like, that feel good that you got one over on our 10-year-old? When I'm not able to stop myself, he's like, you feel like the big lady in the house? Like, knowing that and discerning the difference between what would feel good to have that zinger in that moment and checking in with the outcome that I want. Especially with her going into the teen years, I want her to be able to talk to me about anything.
Nothing more important.
Nothing more important. So with that outcome in mind, I'm able to dig deeper and handle that conversation much more professionally, to cross the borders on the metaphor. But I see that happening because I'm so aware of it with her. I notice where I do that things with my staff and with my team sometimes where it's a little bit easier to gloss over it there because it's not so raw.
Yeah. And like you said, and like we've emphasized, that's a muscle that has to be developed. Oh, yeah. That's just a lot of work. The first few times it happened, my gums were bleeding with her because I didn't handle it in the moment. So it's definitely a process. So that's our story.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so grateful for everyone who's listening in, and we're especially grateful to all of our patrons who've joined us over at patreon.com to support our efforts here. And we hope to see you next week.
And listen, having told our story, we'd love to hear yours.
Ooh, yeah.
So I guess what we're trying to say is the floor is yours. Go to sohere'smystory.com and join the conversation.
Wait, before you go, there are 3 things that we really want you to know.
First, you can find show notes and links to all of the random things we happen to mention during the episode by visiting our website, sohere'smystory.com.
The second thing is we like to talk.
And not just to each other.
That's right. So what we really want to hear is your story. So while you're there, you'll also find links to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and other ways to contact us with questions, suggestions, or even to share your own story.
And if you love the show and want to support future episodes, you'll also find the link to our Patreon page where we share our extra bonus content.
Or if you can't support us financially, it'd be great if you could leave us a 5-star review at iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever podcast service you use to listen to us. And be sure to tell all your friends.
Until next time.